Afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'm Shadow Jones. I'm Legislative and Policy Counsel at the Treatment Advocacy Center, the national nonprofit that is dedicated to eliminating barriers to timely and effective treatment for severe mental illness. Too often, our laws require individuals to meet strict standards of overt physical harm to themselves or others before care can be provided. And these standards not only delay intervention, but perpetuate avoidable suffering. So I'm pleased to introduce Brian Stettin, Senior Advisor for Severe Mental Illness Policy at the New York City Mayor's Office and TAC alumni, who will discuss how psychiatric deterioration laws can serve as a critical tool in preventing harm by recognizing the danger of under and untreated psychiatric illnesses. If you could place your questions and answers or your questions as we go through the presentation in the question answer box. If we have time at the end, we'll address them, and anything that we do not get to, we will provide you with an email and we'll make sure to answer your question. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Shadow. And so great to be with everyone today. Really appreciate you jumping on this webinar. As Shadow alluded to, I spent 13 years at TAC as its policy director, where I obviously learned a tremendous amount about the subject matter that we're going to delve into today. And it's where I came to the conclusion that the psychiatric deterioration standard is really the kind of the gold standard for what should be possible to get somebody psychiatric care in a hospital when they're unable to recognize their own need for it. And spent many years at TAC working to have that enacted in a number of states, and have kind of taken that fight to New York, where I've been since 2022, actually returning back home to New York, where as part of Mayor Adams' agenda, we have been working on the state level to convince our lawmakers in Albany that this is something that New York is in desperate need of. And haven't quite gotten to that ultimate goal yet in New York, but as I'll come back to at the end, this kind of advocacy takes persistence. So we're far from ready to give up. Let me start with kind of a little bit of background to just kind of orient everyone as to exactly what we're talking about here today when we talk about inpatient commitment standards, hospital standards. I think it's important to understand this is about what it takes to get somebody admitted to a hospital for psychiatric care when they're unable to recognize their own obvious and desperate need for treatment, oftentimes when it's painfully obvious to everyone around them and the person themselves can't recognize it. Sometimes the detractors that we have in this advocacy that we do will kind of caricature our position on this issue as if we think that hospital care is itself the end, right? That's what we're trying to accomplish, is to just kind of get people out of the way, get them warehoused in hospitals, and then we're ready to kind of wash our hands of the situation as if we've solved the problem. That, of course, is completely false. I'm sure many of the people on this webinar are in this fight because of people who they love very dearly, who are suffering from severe mental illness and a lack of insight. And of course, for you, that's only the beginning of what's going to be a long struggle, ultimately with the goal of getting that person that you love to that least restrictive, appropriate environment for them, which for the great majority of people with severe mental illness is going to be a return to the community. So the reason we care so much about getting someone to a hospital is because at TAC, certainly, and among all of us who are fighting this fight, we recognize that when somebody is in acute psychiatric crisis, any hope we have of getting them to that ultimate good place starts with some time spent in a hospital, where you've got to get the person on the right medication. You've got to take some time to adjust those meds. You have to sometimes, if they've been living unsheltered, teach them, allow them to relearn some basic habits of self-care. You have to kind of slow the process of discharge down enough to make sure that you're going to discharge them to the right place in an environment where they're going to have a supporting, a fighting chance of being supported and staying safe and stable in the community. So the point is, it all begins with a trip to the hospital. And on this slide, I have kind of highlighted an article I was really gratified to see in the New York Times. Some of the work we're doing in New York City has been controversial. And, this particular story about a man named Mazu Moncalia was really just about how that trip to the hospital, which may not have been pretty at the moment it happened, where it took some actual physical force to get him into and off of the ambulance, led to some really great things for him and put him on a track to permanent supportive housing and a return to the community, and just a night and day difference in his outlook and his prospects in life. So that's what this is about. How do we get somebody to the hospital when they need that time in the hospital as a first step on that long road to recovery? And of course, it should go without saying that the optimal thing is to do that voluntarily. We want people to want to come to the hospital. That's certainly going to help ensure a successful outcome if the person is on board with the idea of treatment and recognizes their own need and is going to personally invest and engage in the kind of treatment that's provided. But we also have to recognize that's not always possible. And if we insist on self-direction as a precondition for any hope of recovery, what we're basically doing is writing off people who, by no fault of their own, can't self-direct, can't volunteer for care because of lack of insight, right? The clinical term that those of you who have been in tax orbit, I'm sure, have heard quite a lot is anosognosia. Here we have a slide that demonstrates what anosognosia looks like in the brain of somebody with severe mental illness. It's by no means universal among people who suffer with these illnesses, but it's extremely common with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, probably afflicting about half of folks at either on a fixed basis or in a way that kind of comes and goes, where a person, because of this neurological deficit that's a corollary of the illness, is simply unable to recognize that they have a need for treatment. And so, this is sometimes mistaken for stubbornness or pride or denial. It's none of those things. It's about dysfunction of an organ of the body, as you're seeing here on these two slides, where two people with schizophrenia are being asked to perform a self-reflective activity. And with the person who suffers from anosognosia, you can see that's the brain on the left. The activity that you see on the brain on the right just isn't happening. Synapses aren't firing in a way that allows that person to even recognize what is so obvious to those of us observing the individual. And so that kind of puts the moral ball in our corner, right? We can't write it off and say, well, this is about this person's choice and kind of absolve ourselves of any responsibility. We have to recognize in many cases, this is not a choice a person's going to be able to make. And the question becomes, what are we going to do to help them? And so this is why we have involuntary treatment laws. It's universal in every state, very much guided by precedents that the Supreme Court has laid down as guidance. This is not something that we want to ever do lightly or without giving a person due process, because we have to acknowledge there is a deprivation of liberties that's very significant involved when you say someone has to come to the hospital for the purposes of treatment when they'd rather be anywhere else. We're depriving them of liberty, and so we've got to have really good reasons to do that. That's a constitutional requirement. And so the specifics of how this is handled by our state laws, there's some variation, but there is also kind of a universal element to it, basically to effectuate both involuntary removal from the community, that is taking somebody from a street setting and against their will, transporting them to a hospital for evaluation, and then involuntarily admitting that person to a hospital. From that evaluation period, actually admitting them as an inpatient to the psych unit of that hospital for a period of time. There are going to be two basic requirements in every state that will have to be met. First of all, the person's going to have to actually demonstrate mental illness. So that's going to be the appearance of mental illness to remove somebody, and an actual diagnosis of mental illness to ultimately admit them to a hospital. And secondly, we're going to have to find that mental illness creates a likelihood of serious harm to that person if it's not addressed, if it's not treated. That is commonly referred to as the idea of a danger to self or others. And again, these standards are worded differently in state to state and have actual different substance from state to state, as we're going to get into in some depth. But these are the basic parameters of what it takes anywhere in the United States to have somebody brought to a hospital for treatment in psychiatry against their will. So what does it mean to be a danger to self or others? Because I think that's really where the rub is in these standards and where there tends to be the most kind of debate and controversy. And we can even drill down more than that, because the danger to others part is pretty straightforward. I don't observe a whole lot of controversy about what it means to be a danger to other people. This is, as you would imagine, about putting other people at a risk of physical harm, either through violence or a threat of violence, or engaging in conduct that puts others at good reason to fear for their physical safety. The danger to self part is trickier, and it's where we get into more controversial interpretations and situations. When you have someone who appears to be a danger to other people, there tends not to be a whole lot of hand-wringing over whether we can hospitalize them. But when we're doing it strictly for the reasons of saving that person from a really tragic path, when it's simply about our compassion and our desire to help somebody avert a tragic fate, that's where we tend to, I think, really have to ask ourselves what this is all about, what we mean by danger to self. And again, there's a kind of a surface layer to this that's pretty easy to identify, and that's where the person's mental illness is putting them at imminent risk of physical harm, right? And that's the person who could be suicidal, or even if they don't intend to kill themselves, they're mutilating themselves in some way intentionally, causing physical harm to their body. Or maybe they're engaging in some outrageously dangerous conduct that could easily lead to serious physical harm, even if they don't actually have the intent to harm themselves. They might have a delusion that they can fly, or that they're impervious to traffic, and so they're, in New York City, stepping onto train tracks, and other places maybe running into streets, trying to jump off rooftops. Or maybe that person has some imminent medical emergency that they can't recognize because their mental illness is not allowing them to see what's happening to them medically. And if we don't get them to a hospital, they could suffer significantly in the very near future. All that is, I think, beyond controversy. And often, people who oppose our efforts to go further in how we interpret danger to self will try to kind of cloak themselves with reasonability by saying, hey, I'm in favor of involuntary treatment, and I recognize there's a need for it. Usually when you press them, all they really mean by that is they recognize there's a need to do it when somebody is suicidal or engaging in, outrageously dangerous conduct. But that doesn't get us very far, right? Because we really should not have to wait until a person is in those kind of dire straits before we can intervene. Because what we're trying to do there, we're really kind of tempting fate. First of all, we're letting a person get a whole lot sicker than they need to, more acutely ill. But we're also imagining that we could time our intervention at the very moment before that imminent risk of serious physical harm actually results in serious physical harm. And we don't have a great track record of making that happen. So our efforts to interpret danger to self in a broader, more compassionate way, I think, really take two forms. On one level here, I think we've had almost complete success in getting this incorporated into the state laws. And that is by recognizing that a person can be a danger to themselves in the sense that their mental illness creates a grave disability. That is a risk of serious physical harm to them that may not be imminent, but that is sure and steady, right? They're on a slow path to almost inevitable self-destruction due to their inability to meet their basic human needs of food, clothing, shelter, or medical care. And recognizing this as a form of being danger to oneself, at least in the laws, right? If you look on the books of just about every state at this point, we've gotten there. Again, that's not to say we're there in practice, as I'll get to in a minute. But just looking at the laws themselves, just about everywhere, and I'm proud to say that New York is about to join this list. So, we've got some state budget language that's about to be enacted that will make it clear that this is also the law in New York. But the real challenge here is just getting folks working in mental health systems to recognize this. As far as changing the laws, we've kind of done it. All right, we only have at this point only DC and Delaware left that have not explicitly acknowledged in their laws that grave disability is a form of danger to self or others. the third layer, and what we're really here to talk about today, what all this introduction has kind of led up to, and this is what I would say is the most progressive way that we can interpret what it means to be a danger to oneself, is to recognize a significant risk of psychiatric deterioration that leads to a significant possibility that person's brain will suffer if their mental illness is not treated, is what unlocks our ability to help people in a much more proactive way, as we'll discuss. And this is actually now on the books in about half the states. So when I was at TAC and we did a really kind of deep dive into all the state laws for a report that we put out in, I believe, 2021, we identified language in just about half the states that you could point to and say, this makes it possible to hold someone for involuntary treatment simply on the basis of a risk of harm to their brain that's going to result from them not accepting treatment for their mental illness. So just to kind of look at what a state law looks like that needs improvement, that hasn't gotten there yet. Hold on. This is the New York law that I've pulled up here as it exists prior to the changes we're about to enact. And you can see that it speaks of we don't use the phrase danger to self or others. In New York, it's likely conduct likely to result in serious harm. And it gives you some very specific examples of what that might be. Again, really just kind of focusing on what the uncontroversial parts of it, right? A substantial risk of serious physical harm to the person as manifested by threats or attempts at suicide or serious bodily harm. If you jump to the end there, it talks about a substantial risk of physical harm to other people as manifested by homicidal or other violent behavior that puts people in reasonable fear of serious physical harm. And then there is this great New York cop-out in the middle that I've underlined here, right? They identify the possibility of other conduct demonstrating that the person is dangerous to themselves or others. And what other conduct that might be is really kind of left in the eye of the beholder. But I can tell you over decades, it's really been just sort of read out of the statute. And, too often, danger to self or others is understood strictly in terms of a person being imminently dangerous or suicidal or at risk of hurting somebody else. Happily, however, there is some case law that has come into play in New York that has made this a little bit better, right? So the gravely disabled piece that we lack in our law explicitly has been read into our vague statute, most notably in the Boggs case in the 80s, where the court basically said that extreme self-neglect is a form of danger to self. And although we've had some messaging challenges in making that widely understood throughout the system, we've had that. And we in New York City have certainly been acting in our policy on the basis of getting help for people who are not meeting their basic human needs. And it's the basis for so much of what we're doing in the subway system among people who are unsheltered and posing no particular threat to anybody, but just really in kind of horrible physical condition. We're, as I said earlier, about to make that explicit in the law, because we sometimes have situations where doctors at hospitals or judges who, as a city implementing policy, we don't have any control over, sometimes release people or discharge people prematurely because they have not fully embraced this, what the courts have said here. And so we're going to happily end any debate about this by making this explicitly part of our law in the next couple of weeks. But what we don't have in New York, and certainly no court has ever suggested we have, is a psychiatric deterioration standard, an ability to recognize the potential of harm to the brain as a basis for action. And what we're talking about here, to put a kind of a fine point on it, is the idea of the law recognizing that when you release somebody from a hospital or leave someone on the street in a condition of psychosis or acute mania, it's doing real harm to the brain, right? We have lots of studies at this point, a mountain of studies that tell us that one of the keys to psychiatric recovery is to minimize that duration of untreated psychosis. DUP is the acronym for that. And the research tells us that the shorter that duration of untreated psychosis, the greater that person's prospects for recovery. So if we leave that person psychotic and wait for them to meet some of these other standards that we've been talking about, we're actually creating a reality where when they come back to the hospital, their ceiling is lower than it would have been had we dealt with it earlier. So we don't have the luxury of giving people time to figure it out, I think is the basic point here, because psychosis, acute mania, that is a medical emergency that has to be dealt with as soon as possible. And in fact, there are some studies that have actually established a link between duration of untreated psychosis and physical brain damage. This is an area that we still certainly need more science on. There's more learning to be done, but the trend in the research is pretty clear, and it's something that in policy and law we need to be paying attention to. So what is the point then? What do we accomplish if we recognize a risk of serious psychiatric deterioration as a category of danger to self in and of itself? The answer to that is it facilitates earlier intervention with a person who's in psychiatric crisis, right? So imagine an individual who's not at the point where they're homeless and in deplorable physical condition. They haven't yet burned all their bridges with family, right? If we discharge them from the hospital today, they still have a home to go to and loved ones who are going to take care of them and put food on the table. But that psychosis is going to keep working its number on the brain, right? And so they're going to get worse and worse. And things will almost inevitably cycle down for them. They will decompensate to the point where those other problems are almost inevitably around the corner. But for now, we can't identify a risk of serious physical harm. We can only identify a risk of serious harm to their brain if we let them alone, leave them alone, leave them to their own devices. So this is about averting tragedy, right? This is about keeping people out of those situations where it's not so easy to extricate themselves from. That's why this is important. That's why this matters. That's why this is a game changer. So let's just look at a couple of laws and a piece of legislation that have attempted to recognize this in state law. Here you're looking at one of the best statutes on civil commitment, Colorado's, where if you look at how they've defined gravely disabled, right here, they've built it into this definition of gravely disabled. You see the language I've highlighted there in yellow. They're explicitly recognizing that among the harms we're trying to avoid with this person is not just serious bodily harm or serious physical illness. It's also significant psychiatric deterioration as a harm in itself that we should be able to take legal action to avoid. And here's what we have been trying to do in New York. This is the language of the Mayor Adams's bill called the Supportive Interventions Act, which I drafted. It's been something we've been trying to work through since 2022. And we succeeded in having numerous pieces of it enacted this year, but not this psychiatric deterioration piece. But here you see the way that we attempted to add language to the current kind of vague definition of likely to result in serious harm. And you can see in the middle there that we added explicit language on inability to meet one's basic needs of food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. That part actually is getting enacted this year. But then you can see on the third line that we just slipped in two little words. It's not just about physical harm, it's also about psychiatric harm to the person that we should be able to recognize. My view is this would have been game-changing. It's not something we were able to get the governor of New York to go along with, and so it did not really become part of the legislative debate this year. But it's really all it takes. It's just recognizing that when the law talks about harm, it's not just physical harm, it's psychiatric harm as well. So this is a good moment to make an important point here, because one could certainly argue that the language, the basic language of grave disability already covers the notion of serious psychiatric deterioration, right? Because it's reasonable to ask that, you know, if you have language that says that we can give people treatment if they're not meeting their basic needs of food, clothing, shelter, or medical care, well, medical care, that's on the list, ding, ding, ding. Is an inability to accept psychiatric care a form of inability to accept medical care? Psychiatric care is medical care. Absolutely true. One could also say that, you know, where the laws are requiring a finding of physical harm, that harm to the brain is physical harm. The brain is a part of the body. It is a physical organ. If it's being harmed, that's physical in nature. I don't quibble with any of that. My answers to both those questions are a resounding yes. I actually think that if you interpret the law reasonably with common sense, even any basic grave disability language should get you the opportunity to take care of people who are at risk of serious psychiatric deterioration. The problem is in trying to persuade the rest of the world to see it that way, right? Because we have to acknowledge a reality that, right or wrong, we're swimming upstream when we try and convince people that psychiatric care is medical care, right? I mean, even in New York, we often talk about a person, we say we couldn't get him admitted to the hospital for psych, but we did get him medical care. We did get him admitted to medicine, as if psychiatric care doesn't involve medicine, right? We tend to think of these things as different. We think of psychiatric care as being kind of a category apart from medical care. We tend to think of harm to the brain as somehow being different than physical harm. And, I would love to live in a world where that were not the case, where we had such enlightenment that these things were universally recognized as true. Living in the real world, we've got to write statutes that communicate to people and make people understand what it is exactly we're trying to accomplish and who we're trying to help. And so the need to make this more explicit, to kind of write this in specific terms, is just about getting over the hump that, we have to acknowledge, and that people see these things, physical health and psychiatric health, as distinct. So let me walk through some of the most typical objections that I have heard in the years I've been doing this advocacy to the idea that we should have explicit language to recognize a risk of psychiatric deterioration as grounds for involuntary hospital care. I think there's some validity to some of these arguments, and just kind of want to take three of the more notable ones, the more common ones that we often hear, and put them under the microscope. First, probably the most common objection, I think just kind of a visceral reaction sometimes people have to this notion when it's presented to them and they don't know a lot about this issue, is that it sounds kind of vague and amorphous and slippery, right? Physical harm is something people can really get their heads around. Everyone kind of knows what it is, but a lot of people reasonably worry that when the law is opening up to the possibility of hospitalizing someone on the basis of a risk of psychiatric harm, that seems kind of more open to abuse, that could be interpreted in ways that could lead to really inappropriate civil commitments and give the state way too much power than if we ground it strictly in an idea of serious physical harm. And look, I think there is some potential truth to that concern. But I think it's actually very solvable, because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about when we say what we want to base these commitments on is psychiatric testimony, right? The expert testimony of a doctor who will come to a court hearing and present their findings that amount to three things. First of all, a finding by a psychiatrist that a person has a severe mental illness. They've diagnosed that severe mental illness. Secondly, that they find that this is a person who lacks insight into this illness, doesn't know that they have it. And third, that they are unwilling to accept treatment, that all reasonable efforts have been made to make this person, even in spite of their lack of insight, to accept treatment for the mental illness, and they've made very clear that they have no interest or intention to do so, as you might expect of someone who doesn't know they have an illness. But, in some cases, people who lack insight are still willing to take medication for other reasons. But when you have all three of these things, that's really all we're talking about. And it's not that hard to nail down these three specific findings by a psychiatrist. And the concern that people have that this is somehow slippery and amorphous, I think, is solved by simply putting language directly into the statute that makes clear that a hospitalization on these grounds, if challenged, will only hold up if you have a psychiatrist who will come to court and make these specific findings part of their testimony. A second objection that I've heard a lot to the idea of making this an explicit part of the law relates to the fact that we're not, when we talk about involuntary treatment laws, we're not just talking about the laws that allow us to involuntarily hospitalize someone once they come to a hospital and get evaluated there. We're also talking about the laws that make it possible to involuntarily transport somebody from a community setting to a hospital. And more often than not, That's a decision that's made by a police officer who's observing a person and making a decision. This is someone who is a danger to themselves or others, appears to be mentally ill, and has to come to a hospital for an evaluation. And many have said in reaction to the idea of a psychiatric deterioration standard that they're uncomfortable with it because of the idea of empowering police in this way, that a police officer is not qualified to identify a person at risk of serious psychiatric deterioration, and therefore they really should not have the authority to remove a person, to transport a person for hospital evaluation on that basis. I actually think that's completely fair. And to get around this concern, I think personally that it's totally appropriate to statutorily limit where this psychiatric deterioration standard is going to apply or where it can potentially be used. Very often people are brought to the hospital because they are presenting a danger to themselves and others in one of the more conventional ways, either through erratic behavior that's putting somebody at risk of harm, or a failure to meet their basic needs that has them in kind of deplorable and alarming physical condition. When that person comes to the hospital, they often get some treatment that might alleviate those immediate concerns, but they have no intention of staying engaged with treatment. They lack insight. And so at that point, it becomes necessary to hospitalize them on the basis of a risk of serious psychiatric deterioration. And I have no problem, and I think it's actually a pretty good idea, to limit the application of this standard to decisions that are being made by doctors, to not actually give police officers the authority to say somebody has a risk of psychiatric deterioration, and to not give cops the power to transport people to the hospital on that basis. I also think it's not really as big a deal and not as big of a worry as it may seem to somebody just kind of imagining what might happen when you look at the real world implications of it. Because I think it's actually pretty rare that you would find a situation where a police officer would even choose to bring someone to a hospital on that basis. I don't think police officers generally would feel comfortable doing that. In my own experience, certainly in the job I have now, working a lot with police officers, I find that they are just getting them to think in terms of bringing someone to the hospital based on the grave disability standard is a challenge, because police officers are kind of hardwired to think in terms of public safety risks. And if they're not seeing one, they tend not to want to be involved in it. It's the reason why in New York, so many of our hospital transports are now being performed by clinicians. We've gotten more nurses onto the ground through a few programs we've started to actually make these decisions to implement this grave disability piece of our law. And so, getting police over that hump, I think would be really hard and probably wouldn't happen. But to give people peace of mind, I think it's totally fine to just not give police that authority in the first place. A third objection I've heard a lot to expanding the law in this way is that it's going to open the floodgates of the hospital to many more patients than hospitals can handle. People think of this in terms of a widening of the aperture, right? It's going to bring lots more people into hospital care, and in just about every state now, we're facing a reality where we have a demand for hospital care, even under existing laws, that often exceeds the number of beds we have. And we have all kinds of challenges everywhere to get more beds online and the staff to actually be able to provide those beds once we have secured them physically. People worry that these problems are going to get even worse if we have laws that just bring lots more people into the hospital. And I think we can allay this concern by just having people understand what a misunderstanding it is, right? Having a standard based on a risk of significant psychiatric deterioration is not likely to increase the overall number of people over the course of, say, a year that are going to require psychiatric hospitalization. And I would say I wish we had studies on this specifically. It's really an area of research that I think kind of begs for more attention. Comparing states that have psychiatric deterioration standards to those who don't, I have no sense at all that more people get hospitalized. I think the differences are really kind of anecdotal, and a lot of that may just be because those laws haven't been applied quite as proactively as they should be. But I really believe, even in the best case scenario, that all the people who come to the hospital because they're at risk of significant psychiatric deterioration, or who remain there because the doctor feels that would be a danger of letting them go, those are all folks who are going to be coming back to that hospital at some point anyway, in almost all cases. It's virtually inevitable that these individuals who leave a hospital or don't come to a hospital in the first place in a state of acute psychosis or mania are going to decompensate. And, it's a rare person with this illness who manages to avoid winding up in a hospital. But the problem is so often that it happens when a person is extremely ill, when things become so bad that it's impossible to ignore anymore. And sometimes there are real social costs that we pay for that. Sometimes the person has committed some criminal act that now has them in the clutches of the criminal justice system. And when they come back to the hospital, it's under a forensic commitment, and it's not so easy to get them out of that. So to me, having this standard is not about bringing more people to the hospital. It's about getting the same people who are going to wind up in the hospital anyway into care earlier and more effectively when they are less acutely ill. And in the end, I believe that should reduce the demand for hospital beds by allowing people to get treatment sooner and more efficiently. And I think if you look at the course of a year, when you really put not only this law in place, but actually a policy in place to make it happen, I think you would find that the same number of people wound up coming to the hospital because you haven't increased the number of people with these kinds of severe mental illnesses. But they got treated a whole lot more effectively. We helped them avoid the revolving door. And so in the end, in the aggregate, I think you're talking about less hospital days in a person's lifetime rather than more. And so the fact that we have shortages of beds in so many places and so many demands on our resources, to me, that's an argument in favor of doing this rather than an argument against it. Before I open to Q&A, let me just say a little bit about how I think people can effectively advocate for getting these laws enacted for those of us who live in states that don't have this on the books. And let me also say that, I'm under no illusions that this is something that's widely happening and that really is accessible, this kind of treatment on this basis in the states that do have it on the books, because there's often a gulf between what the law allows in practice. And that's why we also need people in office who are going to actually be committed to making the optimal use of the laws we have. That's a whole nother battle, a whole nother webinar, certainly something that I'm much more involved in day to day because I'm, really proud to work in an administration that is committed to making the most use of the laws we have and leveraging them. But I recognize that it doesn't always happen, but we have to start with the law, right? We have to get the laws on the books and then move to that next battle and get them used. So how do we get these laws on the books in the half the states that don't have them? And how do we get them improved in the many states that do have them, but just don't have, could be written more explicitly and clearly? I think the biggest challenge here is about education, right? Because lawmakers generally know nothing about this risk of psychiatric deterioration and the potential harm that could come of it. They don't recognize that the time it might take somebody to figure out that they need mental health treatment or act out in a way that allows us to bring them in involuntarily, it's actually costing them in terms of what is possible in their recovery. So in that sense, it's very different than advocating for a gravely disabled standard, where I think it's just kind of more visceral, common sense. People recognize somebody who's not meeting their basic human needs because of mental illness should get some help, and we shouldn't have to wait till the moment where their harm is imminent. That's much easier in comparison to making people understand the need for this. This is largely about educating people about mental illness. And that's something that I think TAC can be enormously helpful with. I would encourage all of you who are involved in state level advocacy to really make use of TAC, bring the team into your state, let them help you get that information out there. Second point I would make is that it's just so important to make this relatable. To find people who can tell their personal stories about how they themselves suffered unnecessarily because they didn't get treatment as early as they might have if someone had been more attuned to their need to avoid psychosis, or people who had a family member experience a tragedy that they're continuing to live with this pain with the rest of their lives because they didn't get treatment as early as they might have. We let the person leave a hospital in a state of psychosis and something terrible happened to them, or they committed some act that now has them in prison. People telling these stories is the single most effective tool you can have in making those who are not personally impacted by it understand why this is so important. Another thing I would do in my advocacy on this issue and have tried to do in New York is to really emphasize that science on the duration of untreated psychosis. The fact that duration of untreated psychosis matters so much in mental health recovery is absolutely essential to the argument we're making here. And there are researchers who have studied this issue who I think all of us can do a whole lot more, and bringing them into this conversation, this policy, this political conversation, bringing them as experts in to testify at bill hearings, I think is something that would make an enormous difference in helping us communicate this message. I'd also say, and this is very relevant to what we're experiencing in New York with the success we've had in getting some significant changes to our law this year, that if you, like me, live in a state where this is a tough sell because you have a very kind of civil rights oriented legislature, and I use that term for lack of a better one because I actually think that the civil right to treatment is among the most compelling of all. But for those who have a misguided sense that there's something not progressive or abusive of people's civil rights to make it easier to get them hospitalized when they don't want to be there, it's very hard to fight this battle in a state like that, where that's kind of the prevailing mentality, by pushing it as a standalone bill, where the merits of the bill itself are really all you're standing on. And it's going to be really hard to overcome a lot of the kind of intractable opposition of people who are not hearing you, not listening to you, not open-minded, and just have a kind of a sense of identity that's tied to the idea that I can't possibly allow this because that would make me a terrible person. I live in a state like that, right? The way we managed to make some changes this year, and I think it's really the key to getting the psychiatric deterioration standard ultimately done, is to win over the governor of your state and to leverage the budgetary process. In just about every state, a legislative session is about two things. It's about passing individual acts of legislation, but also about passing a state budget. And there are some states where that state budget is just purely dollars and cents. They don't do any policy in the state budget. But in most states, the governor uses that budget process to sneak in some policy ideas that would be hard to sell as standalone bills. Because the idea is that because this becomes part of the horse trading that goes on during budget time, where legislatures are kind of sometimes forced to accept things because the governor is insisting on it, and it's part of what they have to swallow in order to get certain things they want out of the budget process, right? The horse trading that goes on during budget season. That's really, I think, the right time and place and way to get some of these more controversial legal changes enacted. So win over your governor and have your governor make it part of their budget negotiation, I think is a really key tactic for not just this, but any other sort of legislative priority that you think might be a kind of a tough sell on its own, because it gets you more leverage behind what you're trying to accomplish. Last piece of advice I'd have is to be patient and to be tenacious. And again, this is a piece of advice that would apply to any kind of significant legislative win you are seeking. It often takes many years of groundwork. My friends at TAC know that very well. We have had many wins that were a decade or more in the making. AOT and getting passed in Maryland last year comes to mind. AOT in New Mexico certainly jumps to mind as a personal bugaboo of mine. It took many years, and there were points where it seemed absolutely hopeless. Sometimes it's tragic events, sadly, that bring this issue more to the forefront and create opportunities that you have to be ready to jump on. But don't expect this to happen in a session or two just because it makes so much sense to you. And why can't other people see it? You got to keep coming back at them year after year after year. And amazing things can be accomplished if you're patient and tenacious. So that leaves us 15 minutes. I appreciate everybody hearing me out. Hope that was illuminating, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. We have a few questions in the question and answer box, and I encourage you to continue to type your questions in there if you have more. Janet Hayes provided, she said, thanks to Brian, Michael, and TAC with your help in changing our grave disability standard to include psychiatric deterioration, including physical deterioration. Would you recommend the state educate on the law change as the best way to implement changes? So I know that you spoke to this extensively, that education is one of is a critical and vital way to implement change. But I wanted to ask this question anyway, just to highlight that I think education is important, not only when the law changes, but ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Janet makes a great point. And, I spoke of the need to educate lawmakers as to why it's necessary to change the law. But as Janet puts her finger on, there's also a significant need, once you have a law on the books, to educate and train folks in the field as to why they ought to use it. Because at the end of the day, the law is only going to be as effective as it is used. And there's nothing we can do to mandate that police departments and outreach teams and hospitals and judges, well, judges do have to follow the law, but certainly some of those other parties who actually bring those cases to bear, they've got to actually see value in it and be willing to use it. So, yeah, I think that, certainly state mental health departments have to get behind. Once you have this on the books, if you happen to be in a state now that has had it for years, I think it's very worthwhile to see if you can get your state mental health department to make a significant push for education among people who you've identified as being kind of classes of folks who are responsible for implementing the law, to get that information out there to them and get them to use it.
I agree, and that's something that TAC is definitely willing and happy to assist with as well. We're happy to help with advocacy materials and education materials on that front. David Donor, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, asked, why did the governor not get on board with the definition changes that you were wanting?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that, like most political figures, the governor is interested in fighting battles she thinks she can win. I think she felt it was a little bit of a bridge. I don't think she was as oriented to the concept. I think it was kind of new to her. It's something that I think, going forward, we might be able to kind of wear down resistance to over time. But I think her initial reaction to it this year, this was really the first year that we got her to take very seriously the idea of building in to her budget some of these ideas we had. And I think she saw that as just something that would face too much opposition from the legislature for her to want to take on. Personally, made me governor. I would believe that there are fights worth having, even if you're not going to win. Sometimes it's a good idea to get caught trying, and you get some credit for that. But, I also understand that, from their vantage point, sometimes if you don't get it accomplished, if you don't accomplish what you set out to do, it sometimes makes you look like you failed. And so I think because of their aversion to that, there was a little bit of conservatism and only wanting to take on what they saw as the hardest changes to argue against. And so that one kind of got left on the cutting room floor, but there's always next year.
And that goes back to what you were saying about being patient, and that these changes take some time to get people on board for.
Yeah.
And Jerry Clark asked, do you see a way to leverage the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act as a reason for hospitals to get on board with a psych deterioration standard?
I'm not sure I see the connection, but I wonder if we can turn on the microphone of the person asking that to explain a little more what they might mean by how that law relates. Is that possible?
I'm not sure if we can add her as a panelist, but if you could type into the chat, Jerry.
Yeah, let's come back to that one if we can get some.
We got her. I think we got her. Okay.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Jerry.
Thank you. Hi, Brian. Nice to see you. So, and I see Sonia Burns is here too. So I'm guessing that she also might be curious what your thoughts are on this question. So if EMTALA means that a hospital emergency department shouldn't discharge someone in an unsafe way,
Yeah.
and they are psychiatrically deteriorated, but maybe not overtly dangerous, it seems to me like these two concepts are bumping into each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I want to look at the law and maybe I can follow up with you if you want to get in touch with me by email and I just kind of want to see what the language of that law actually requires of hospitals, but you know, I imagine come down to what it means by, you know, the responsibility to not discharge someone in an unsafe condition.
Right.
And you know, it's an interesting thought that I'd like to consider more.
Cool. And I bet Sonia would have thoughts and Shadow might also. So maybe
Yeah.
we can start a little conversation. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. And then Sonia asked, can we push to require states to publish public-facing dashboards on their forensic waitlists and the breakdown of forensic versus civil and voluntary admissions in their state hospitals?
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. I mean, I work for a city government rather than a state government, but certainly we're under a lot of pressure to be forthcoming about with our data. We have a city council that puts lots of requirements on us to publish data, and we're about to we've had to deliver a report to our city council about the number of involuntary commitments we did, involuntary removals and demographics of the people and outcomes for them. And so, you know, we're about to even go beyond what was required there and are about to put a public facing dashboard on the city's website that will update those stats in real time rather than just once a year as the city council required. But, you know, if you're in a state that's not forthcoming with some of that information, I think it's a great idea to put pressure on them legislatively to tell you what's going on.
Les, if you want to go ahead and jump in.
Absolutely. Brian, you make a great point. And Sonia, you're absolutely right. We need to be putting that pressure on. That was, in fact, one of the recommendations from the TAC Prevention Over Punishment report. And on a positive, optimistic note, we are seeing legislation being introduced to do just that. So highly recommend going forward with that in every state.
Awesome. I see a question from Betsy in the chat. So you want to read that, Shadow?
Yes. Hi, Brian. Do you think there are instances, particularly in smaller communities, where it would be appropriate for a crisis intervention trained officer with knowledge about the person to use psychiatric deterioration as a basis for transporting someone to an ER crisis facility?
Yeah. I mean, I could see potential for that where I would be comfortable with it. It would make sense to me, but I can also see why someone would be uncomfortable with a police officer ultimately making what is a clinical determination. It's, you know, it's not a permanent clinical determination. It's not that the officer would have the authority to have somebody admitted to the hospital. It's really just about transport. But, you know, if we're in the context of can we get this law enacted, and that's an objection people are raising, that they just aren't comfortable with the idea of police officers having that authority. It's not that I'm personally horrified by it. It's just that I can kind of understand where that objection is coming from. And I could see some potential for abuse of it. And I don't have a particular problem. I don't think it's problematic for a law to foreclose that possibility, because I think there are almost always other grounds to bring the person to the hospital. I think where psych deterioration tends to matter more is when that person their condition has improved with some treatment that they've gotten at the hospital, and now we want to retain them in the hospital. And so I would have no problem giving up that possibility as a way to get a law through the process.
Thank you. And Sonia has asked, has New York City collected data on not putting misdemeanors on the wait list? And then how many of those are coming back with felony charges? So is there any data tracking for, I'm assuming, competency restoration?
Well, so we don't restore people. We don't hold people for competency restoration for misdemeanors at all. Under New York state law, if you are charged with a misdemeanor and are found incompetent to stand trial, your charge is dismissed. And you're released. So we only do competency restoration for felonies.
Has there been any studies or tracking on those that are released or the case is dismissed a misdemeanor, that then return with a felony charge or somehow re-enter the system?
Has there been a study of that specifically? Not that I'm aware of, but I think it'd be a good one. Be worthwhile, for sure.
Thank you. And I think that goes again to the importance of collecting data and transparency on these systems that every state can use. Whether states dismiss in misdemeanor matters when there's question of competency, or whether states have a procedure to retain jurisdiction over those matters.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, so it looks like we have maybe time for one more question, if there is any.
I will go ahead and collect any questions that are left in the question and answer, and we'll make sure to get back to you guys. If you guys did not have an opportunity to ask your question, please feel free to email us at advocacy@tac.org. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Brian, for giving us your time and your expertise.
Absolutely.
And
Always a
some
pleasure.
suggestions on how we can move this measure forward.
Yeah, and it's always enjoyable for me to reconnect with my friends at TAC, and that includes all the folks in TAC's orbit doing incredible work around the country. So
And I see a lot of thanks in the chat. So thank you again, Brian, and thank you everyone for
Sure
being
thing.
here and for advocating.
keep fighting, everybody.
Yes.
See you soon.
Thank you.